All right, we're going to grab our old friend, Steve from Nebraska. Steve is saying, Justin's false premise that enslaved Hebrews would not have been allowed to have their own homes in Egypt, thereby misleading us to conclude that the biblical Passover story would not possibly be true. This is something we talked about recently, Steve, and it sounds to me like you took a little bit of umbrage with my definition of the enslavement of the Hebrews. Is that correct?
Hello.
Hello.
How you doing, Steve?
Did you hear what Justin said?
Steve?
Yeah, I'm having some phone issues. I'm going to have to call back. I can't hear you on the phone.
Yeah, that's fine. We'll throw you in the queue. If you have to call back, call back. We'll totally take your call.
Hold on. I got you. Hold on. I got you now. Yeah, there was some technical issues where I couldn't hear you guys, but I'm hearing you now.
Okay.
Sounds good. Welcome in.
Yeah, we'll have Justin just
JMike and Justin. Yeah. Thanks for fixing that glitch there we had. Thanks. So I'm calling because when Justin and I previously discussed the biblical Exodus narrative's veracity, we wrongly presumed that enslaved Hebrews would not have been allowed to have their own homes in Egypt. And this false premise misled us to conclude that a biblical Passover story could not have been true because the enslaved Hebrews would not have been able to mark their doors for redirecting the angel of death.
I think it's deeper than that.
Towards targeting Egyptian household eldest male children. However,
Steve, hold on real quick.
GBT.
Steve, hold on.
Steve,
we gotta go.
Take a deep breath.
Yeah, we got the gist of it. We want to respond to a portion of that, right?
Yeah. So so I think it's a little bit deeper than the way that you're positing it, right? Because the Hebrews, right, all of them that were saved, meaning their firstborn weren't unalived by the angel of death, all of them were saved because of the blood over the doorpost, right?
Yeah, so what they did is they marked their doors so they could re-guide the angel of death drones away from their homes towards the Egyptian, their slave masters' homes. And there the enslaved, the Israelites would have been spared from having their firstborn purged. Instead, this directed the drones over to the Egyptian households where there would have been a would-be evil slave master to be slaughtered because the firstborn had the property rights to be the slave owners. So that's why they were purged, right?
Right. So my position, in which we talked about last time, is that the way that we think of the slavery of the Israelites in Egypt, according to the Old Testament, I don't think is quite the way we would describe slavery like in the rest of the Bible, right? So, for example, in traditional slavery, like you're somebody's property, typically like you're residing in the home or one of the homes of the owner, but you're like under the same roof, the same way that Joseph was under the roof of Potiphar. This is what we think of when we think of a slave. Now there's an alternative form of slavery. We could call it slavery. In the Hebrew, the word is mas. It refers to forced labor. My contention is that the Hebrews, what they were in Egypt, they were not Ama and Evids. They were actually Mas. They were just forced labor. They weren't actually owned as property, which is why they had all their own houses. Do you understand where my argument is?
Well, yeah, so they had their own homes, so they could have marked their doors, right, to re-guide the angel of death drones away from their homes towards their Egyptian households.
And I think this position is further clarified in the fact that they had elders. The people in Egypt had their own elders that were in charge of the Hebrews and overseeing the labor, which is why, remember, when they were forced to make the bricks, they were given an output, a certain number of bricks that they had to make. This is characteristic of forced labor, of mas, the same thing we see in Deuteronomy chapter 20. It's this idea that a particular people group are going to be forced to commit a certain amount of labor to your people group. It's not quite the same thing as you're my property and I own you. Those are like different categories of slavery. So my categorization of the Hebrews is that they weren't necessarily property of the Egyptians in that kind of slavery. They were more or less forced labor. That make sense?
Okay. Well, my point is that they would have been able to.
Hold on. No. Hold on.
Death drones.
Just real quick, because sorry, Steve. Maybe you're following it up with something. When I hear my point, usually that's followed with just a bunch of stuff that's not going to be like what Justin said. Is there any way you could like repeat back? I'm not telling you to say every word he said. We just want to make sure that you understand why Justin said that, right? Because it's important. Do you think you could
I thought
try to do your best representation of what Justin just said?
Well, if I recall correctly, in our last discussion, he said, "Well, they were the same."
I didn't ask anything about the last. I didn't ask anything about the last discussion. Well, I mean, just what he just said now.
Okay, so what's your question now for me?
What did Justin just say? So make sure we have we can plant a flag in the conversation to know where we're at, because a lot of times we just move on, and we should have addressed something at a certain point in the conversation, right? So that's all I'm trying to do. Maybe it's annoying, and I apologize if it is, but I just think it helps.
Yeah, I mean, Justin's talking about different types of enslavement, or different. This is what I'm getting out of what he's saying. I'm sorry, Justin. What's your point? I'm not quite understanding why you're bringing this up. Why? No.
So my general point is that when we talk about what happened to the Israelites, it seemed to be that they weren't necessarily slaves in that they were owned as property. They were slaves in the manner of being forced to give a certain percentage of production or output, just like the Israelites had slaves that had to carry their water, or they had slaves that had to produce a certain number of cedar trees for them. They were woodcutters, right? These are like tributaries. They're a little bit different than being owned as property. And I forget the conversation we had last time that led to this discussion, but when I say that they weren't slaves in Egypt, that's what I mean. I mean, they weren't owned as property the way it's described in Leviticus chapter 25. They were just forced labor. They were conscripted to provide a certain number or a certain amount of economic output for the Egyptians.
Okay, so it sounds like to me you're describing maybe something more of a feudalism type of a system, where they just worked and gave a certain amount of their productivity to.
That's pretty damn close, actually. Yeah.
Okay. So, and another point of contention I had too. Also, you cited the Book of Exodus, where the city of Ramses is mentioned, thereby implying Ramses was the pharaoh during Exodus, which apparently contradicts 1 Kings 6, where the Exodus is dated well prior to Ramses' reign. However, we should consider Exodus was written well past the time when the city of Ramses was renamed after the city had been reconstructed around the enslaved Hebrew city, in the city of Avaris.
Yes, I'm familiar with the city of Avaris, but the city of Avaris and the city of Ramses are not the same city. They're similar, they're close to each other, but they're not identical. And the storehouses of Ramses are actually quite famous, and they're not quite the same as the storehouses of Avaris. But I'm not sure that matters. I think the wording of Exodus 1:11 is what matters. It says that they built the supply cities of Pithom and Ramses, implying that these supply houses, these cities that Ramses was known for, these were necessarily made by the Israelites, the Hebrews. But we know that the construction of these cities, the city of Ramses, happened during the reign of Ramses II.
Okay, so when do you think the Book of Exodus was written? Do you think that Moses wrote this when he was in the wilderness? No, it was written probably long after that.
Not even close. Yeah, it was written long after Israel already had kings. That's why even in like the book of Genesis talks about the kings of Moab or Edom, I forget which one, up until Israel got their first king. Because who's ever writing the first 5 books, they obviously live long after the United Monarchy. That being said, the problem that we have here is that, like, traditionally speaking, and it seems that Jesus has the same opinion, which is that the first 5 books were written by Moses. Like he talks about the writings in the Torah as though Moses said it.
Yeah. Well, Moses probably said it, and then it got passed down by verbally, and then eventually it got put into writing. So there's these,
Well,
these.
I don't see any proof for that.
verbally.
Yeah, I don't see proof of that, but also like I mean, just think about like any like presidential or a speech, right, or anything where someone gave a lengthy speech and then like a week from then, or even just like an hour from then, try to write everything that they said. You're not gonna do it. You're gonna actually like say things they didn't say. You're gonna miss things. You're gonna exaggerate things. You probably won't say them to the degree that it was said, right? Like. It's just I don't think that's going to help. To me, that's just going to create. That just seems like it's going to justify my view, and thinking that a lot of this is just a bunch of garbage.
Okay. Yeah, but that I think helps support my next point I'm going to make is that since the book of Exodus was written down long after it was told, it ended up and cities get renamed a lot. Like look at New York, like it used to be called New Amsterdam, and so they could have just easily got the city of Ramses mixed up with some other place like Avaris or something.
Yeah, but I mean, you have like even
I agree.
more.
Maybe they did, but
yeah,
it would still be wrong.
Yeah, and like, yeah, I don't. It's probably no point of me bringing this up. So I want to get off.
So you're right. They could be confused. The author of the Book of Exodus could be confusing the city of Ramses with Avaris. Certainly, it's possible. But it'd still be wrong. It's still something in the Bible that's incorrect, right? So, like, something has to give.
It's just a small technical glitch. It's a little, like if I wrote about.
It's not a technical glitch.
And I called it New York. I mean, that would just be a small. I mean, that wouldn't change the story. The whole.
One benefit of having it like spoken by God and then Moses writes it down like right then and there is like. This preservation of the word right away, like if I'm going to peer in, whereas like if you're saying it was told and then it was told for a little while and then it was written down, well, one real good benefit of having a written or like a written original of what somebody is saying is that you can go throughout the time, right, that it evolves into different stories and see how that's evolved, right, and see, you can go, oh, there was a bunch of changes made there. That's the kind of benefit you get if you have that kind of original. You don't get that benefit at all if you'd wait a little while, and because what are you going to check? Like you can't go back to the oral source and go check if it's been right. You don't know where in transmission things have messed up, right? You have no way to determine that. So I don't think you're helping yourself by doing that. I think you're creating more problems, at least more problems to know the accuracy of what's being said. I know that's probably besides the point. I don't want to take us away.
And I think there's some like bigger problems. Like, so are you holding that the Exodus was in the 1200s or the 1400s? Which one?
Well, I'm going by the date 1446 under Pharaoh Amenhotep is what I think it probably actually happened. Although if you take from my understanding, if you take the 1 King 6 in the Greek and instead of the Hebrew, it's 450 years before the Solomon Temple instead of 480. So it's possible it could have happened 30 years after the 1446. It could have happened in earlier 1400s. But it didn't happen under Ramses. I think that was just confusion, the way the story got told verbally until it got written down. I just think that maybe there was like a city renaming or something there.
So it couldn't have been written by Moses because it keeps mentioning Ramses over and over again in Exodus.
Right. It wasn't written by Moses. Didn't have time to write everything down. Right. That happened.
I don't think he wrote anything down. I don't think Moses existed.
Right. I agree.
We have no reason to believe that Moses existed. So I just want to make sure we're clear here. Genesis 47:11 says that the Israelites were settled in the land of Ramses. Exodus 1:11 says that they built the storehouses of Pithom and Ramses. Exodus chapter 12 says that they journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. Numbers 3:33 says they set out from the city of Ramses. And then Numbers 33:5 says the thing. They set out from Ramses and they camped at Succoth. Who's ever writing this is writing.
I needed you to say that name twice, actually. I didn't catch it the first time.
I know, right? Who's ever writing Exodus and the latter part of Genesis, they are writing after Ramses II probably already lived and died.
Absolutely.
It's not Moses.
This is what told.
If the Exodus was in the 1400s and Moses exited Egypt in the 1400s, then Moses is not writing any of this.
Right. You're right. I totally agree.
Okay, so we agree then that Moses didn't write the Torah then.
Okay, now you're starting to get me to doubt the existence of Moses again.
Well, there's no good reason to believe in Mosaic authorship.
This is where I gotta come in. This is where I gotta come in, and where Steve, I don't believe you anymore when you say things like that. All right, I just don't believe you when you go like, "Oh, you're starting to make me think." Because the last call we had, you seemed like you were kind of going through a little bit of a deconstruction, but then I kind of realized, and I think me and Justin realized together, that you do this a lot. It seems like you kind of shift, and it's hard to know. So I don't know. Is this going to be another thing where you call me up and then you got at the same point we just restart every time? Because it doesn't sound very fun. I don't think that's fun for the audience either, right? So are you really doubting Jesus?
I mean, I really like to talk with Justin because he's a Bible scholar.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to doubt you. I really am not. It's just I'm just skeptical when you do that. That's all. And I don't want to be, because this is a good thing for you to, in my opinion, to put those beliefs away. But when you call back and stuff, I think there's this meta issue of like, I mean, are you really taking it? Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm just letting you know I'm a little skeptical.
Let's touch on Mosaic authorship just briefly, Steve, because Mosaic authorship to me is a bigger deal than most people realize, right? Because it's clear that the New Testament authors believed Mosaic authorship was true. And if it's not true, then the New Testament's just wrong. But like, we've got lots of passages that would lead us to believe that it couldn't have been written by Moses. For example, Genesis 14:14, right? This is a famous passage where Abraham, is fighting on behalf of his nephew Lot, and he's chasing these marauders away, right? It says he pursued them as far as Dan. Okay, interesting. Do you know where Dan is in Israel?
Well, that was probably some city that could have been renamed. It could have been written long after the story was take place. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, this is really interesting because the tribe of Dan in the book of Judges, originally the tribe of Dan was right next to the Philistines, but they couldn't actually gain foothold in the territory. So they decided to change the location of the tribe of Dan. They moved it all the way to the north. So it's the very northern tip now, right? And this is where Abraham supposedly chased all of these marauders to. So who's ever writing is writing not just after Moses, not just after the Judges, but after the Judges period had already come underway for a couple hundred years, maybe 100 years, and had to move the tribe of Dan far north. So this is hundreds of years after Moses lived, and they're describing what happened using regional characteristics that would only exist hundreds of years after Moses, which leads me to believe that it's just written after Moses, or else there's no reason to have all this stuff in the book that keeps talking about things like Genesis 36:31. It lists a bunch of kings of Edom. It says, these are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites. Well, how the hell would you know there's a king over the Israelites? There's not supposed to be a king for hundreds of years after Moses. They have no way of knowing that because it was written by somebody else long after Moses was already dead.
Agreed, and we got to keep in mind that, when stories get told generations later, things can get lost in translation, right? I mean, things can get, things can become hyperbolic, or things can, there's some truth there, and then things can get maybe exaggerated over, each time, you tell a story and the details get bigger and bigger. Let me
ask you a question.
Keep this in mind.
So on the issue of Mosaic authorship, the existence of Mosaic authorship, the existence of Moses, what would be, say, one proof that would lead me to believe that Moses wrote any of this, or that he's not just a mythological figure?
I don't think you can prove that Moses didn't write it. I don't know how you would know.
Well,
it's so easier. How about just reasons to think?
Right, because I can show you dozens of places where he couldn't have wrote it. He couldn't have wrote Deuteronomy 34, where it says Moses was 120 years old when he died. That didn't happen. He didn't write that, obviously, right? And then like there's other stuff, like Moses's name. There's a lot of debate about what his name actually means, but if it's related to biblical Hebrew in any way, it probably refers to one who's drawn up, meaning drawn out of the water. But like, are you aware that there's already a figure in history that had almost identical backstory to Moses? Do you know who Sargon of Akkad is?
Honestly, I do not.
So the mother of Sargon, he was the most famous king of the Akkadian Empire, and his mother put him in a wicker basket and sealed it with pitch, put it down in the river. It floated down the river, and then it was drawn up by the gardener of the palace. And the gardener found this little baby, Sargon, raised it as his own child, and he eventually ended up being king of all of Akkad, all of the empire. Isn't it wild that like we have this narrative of Moses that this like seems to be paralleling the story of Sargon of Akkad, an outsider who finds its way into the kingdom, gets drawn out of the river, floating in a basket. It's almost like the story of Moses is just like dipping into like a mythological background because it's a mythological story.
Interesting. So yeah, so the book of Exodus was written long after that. So it would have it could have maybe copied this other, because this other story would have been written earlier, right?
I agree, and this is where let me throw you a bone now, Steve, because a lot of people think that I think that everything in Exodus is fiction. I don't think it is fiction. I think there's probably a small group of Israelites or Hebrews or Semitic-speaking people, maybe part of the Hyksos, that left Egypt. And I think they dwelt in the land of Midian. They discovered Yahweh in the land of Midian and took on the god of that region, and then entered the Judean foothills and became numerous enough that they had their own people group, and they became the tribe of Judea. Or they became the tribe of Judah eventually. So like, it's not that everything in Exodus is just completely fabricated. There's probably a kernel, a very small kernel of historical truth in there somewhere. But that being said, that doesn't mean that any of the mythology is true. It doesn't mean that Moses existed. It doesn't mean that Yahweh split the waters and freed the Israelites from Egypt. It doesn't mean that any of the mythology is true. And we find this throughout history. We find, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, with these foundational mythologies that probably did stem originally from a human being that did a thing. And then the mythology grows bigger and bigger and bigger. And before you know it, it's so important to the people group who hold the mythology sacred that now every time a new revelation needs to be put into the mythology, they have to add to the story. Just like the laws of Moses were added later. Like, how do we make new laws and make them authoritative? Well, put them in the mouth of Moses, because that means it was said by God, right? So these mythologies grow and grow and grow because they are mythologies. But if they're mythologies, then that means the New Testament, their understanding of this mythology is just factually wrong, because they think it's all real. They think Adam and Eve really existed. They think Moses really parted the sea. They believe all these things as true stories. But the minute we admit that they're mythologies, well, that means the New Testament isn't true either.
Did Jesus claim that Moses existed, or Noah, or Adam and Eve? Did he claim them to be literal, or?
Yeah, he does with Noah as well, right? He talks about the second coming. It says it's going to be like in the days of Noah, right? People eating and drinking. And then he talks about Moses. He says, for example, Matthew chapter 5, famous passage where Jesus is kind of tweaking some of the laws of Moses. There's a bunch of passages where he instructs people to do something because Moses told you to do it, right? When the leopards gets cleansed, he tells them to follow the law and go to the temple, present themselves at the temple. When he tells the story of Lazarus and the rich man, right? The story kind of concludes with, well, if they wouldn't believe Moses, they won't even believe a man coming back from the dead, right? So we keep having these narratives in the New Testament where they're talking about Moses as though Moses was indeed a real person. But if you don't believe he was a real person, that presents some problems for Jesus, because it seems to be that Jesus did believe he was a real person. For example, in
especially
Mark,
if Jesus is like God and supposed to know everything. It's like, whoa, false proposition. That's kind of hard to square away.
right. Matthew chapter 8, Jesus says to them, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priests and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them," when he's referring to the lepers. So like he's under the impression that the law of Moses was given by Moses.
Well, it was probably passed down verbally and was written later and just got lost in translation.
Well, maybe, but the question I would ask is, what's the evidence that would lead me to believe that any of this was originally penned or written by Moses? And I ask this question because what language do you think Moses would have spoke?
Hebrew.
No, biblical Hebrew didn't exist. Nothing similar to it didn't exist until the 9th century BCE. Moses would have known Egyptian, and he might have known a little bit of Akkadian. Akkadian and Egyptian had some overlap because they had to communicate. Those are the two main languages of the region. But he wouldn't have spoke Hebrew. Not at all, right? So if Moses wrote anything, he would have had to write it either in cuneiform or he would have had to write it in Egyptian hieroglyph. We have no evidence whatsoever that the original first 5 books of the Bible were ever written in Egyptian, not even close to a hint.
Right, and I totally agree. I clearly the first 5 books attributed in the Bible attributed to Moses, they weren't handwritten by Moses. Clearly, that's wrong.
So they were most likely written.
Moses wrote those.
People think Moses wrote them, but if they were written anywhere close to Hebrew, I would say they were written in Paleo Hebrew, and Paleo Hebrew didn't exist until the 9th century. It wasn't really a thing yet. And here's a really good passage I want you to read with me real quick. I want to say Genesis chapter 2, that demonstrates that it was not written originally in Egyptian. It could not have been written originally in Egyptian. It had to have originally been written in biblical Hebrew. So are you familiar with the creation story of woman from Genesis chapter 2?
Yes. So I'm looking at Genesis 2. Now, is the New International, which version translation do you prefer, the King James Version or the New International Version? Which one
I like, there's a couple that I like. I like the NRSV updated edition, and I like the NABRE. Both of those phenomenal scholarly translations without any bias into the translation. But in Genesis 2:23.
Oh, I have the NRSV right here. Okay, I'll put that in New Revised Standard Version. Okay.
I'm totally not using one to prop up something as a stand to prop up something. Totally, I'm not doing that, and it's totally not an NSRV edition. No, I'm just kidding. So it's the King James version.
There's all these different types too. Like there's an Anglicanized version, there's a Catholic edition, and updated. Oh my goodness, how many translations and versions of the Bible do we have here? Which one do you guys like? I'll put that in.
There's a lot. Go to the NRSV UE.
Okay, NRSV UE. Okay, well, yeah, I got that. Okay.
And go to Genesis 2:23.
Standard Version, updated edition. I got the updated edition. All right, let's go with that. Okay.
Now, in 2:23, it says, "Then the man said, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken." Now, in Hebrew, this is a really interesting phrase because he's saying from Ish, Ma'ish, from man, this one was taken, which is why she's called Isha. That's just grammatically the feminine form of Ish, right? So essentially what they're saying is listen, she's called Ish because she came, or she's called Isha because she came from Ish. She's called woman because she came from man. That play on words, that situation grammatically only works in biblical Hebrew. It would never work in Egyptian. It wouldn't work in Akkadian. It only works in biblical Hebrew. So what that means is that this text in Genesis had to have originally been written in Hebrew. It doesn't work in the other languages, which means Moses didn't write it.
Right. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I don't think
So I just
think Moses went around and wrote everything. Yeah.
Right. I can't find any evidence in the text that would lead me to believe that Moses wrote any of this. All the evidence I have points to the contrary.
Right. Yeah, I totally concur. You're right.
Sweet, Steve. So it says you called in about it.
He told the story. He could have said the story, and then it just got written down later after being told from generation to generation.
Sure, but now you're suggesting that there's like a 400-year period of oral tradition, and that could be.
Yeah, but then you're going to get into the problem I raised earlier about like how you know that was what was said and was preserved, and like you're going to run into some massive issues there, right? Like you don't have any way of knowing that something was changed along the way. Your 400-year gap of like, okay, well, you can't go back and go ask the people, hey, how was the story here at this point? Oh, how about the story there at this point? All right, and go back to you can't do that. You have no way of being able to decipher it. Like you get the benefit with like written there. So that's why I was saying, like, I know this is kind of a separate point. It's more of like a justification point about what was said and like the semantic content, but that's a pretty massive issue, right? That we can't justify how the semantic content has changed over time, right? That's a problem. Right. So I don't know that you want to make that move, right? That just sets you into more problems. It seems like to me if I'm tracking this issue. But Steve, we're gonna probably move on to some other callers and get some people in. I don't want to just boot you off, but did you understand because you called in and you said, Justin gave out a false premise, and as someone watching this, it's not clear to me that Justin said a false premise. I mean, I obviously don't have as much knowledge in this as Justin, so I gotta like pretend to be like, yes, I know, but it's not really clear to me that he's holding some dubious kind of claim. So what do you think?
Well, I'm not saying he purposely made a false premise.
No, I'm not talking about intention. Just do you think you had said it was false, right? How's your credence changed since the beginning of the call to the end of the call?
Well, what I originally called for was that the Hebrews could have owned their own home, could have had their own homes, and could have marked doors for a Passover event. That's what I originally. Now I can't even remember what I originally, because these calls.
No, that's fine. I have the benefit of being able to actually read it, so I got to remember that. I lost words. I get it, 100%.
And we got a little bit off track, and I apologize for that. And I would finish up on that topic that you brought up first, just by suggesting that the idea of the Passover wouldn't work unless all of the Hebrews had their own homes, meaning every single one of them had to have a home that was separate from the Egyptians, which to me sounds like they were probably just engaging in forced labor. They weren't actually owned as property. They weren't somebody's slaves in the traditional sense.
Well,
all right, Steve.
The Hebrews could have just they could have just collectively on that night went to the homes that were marked. If they knew this. I'm
gonna, before we go, I want you to notice what you do a lot of times, which is fine. Like people do this, but you do this move where you go, but it could have been this thing. And I think Justin might be like, it could have been, but what's the reason to think that, right? It could have been like a billion things, right? So that's why it's like almost like I don't even want to hear what the rest of the sentence is going to be of like, it could have been this. Because if it's like a could have been, it's like, well, I'm not really interested in what follows the it could have been, unless there's something else to be, packaged in conjunction with that, which is like, it could have been this thing, and I have really good reason to think that it could have been that thing, right? Those are two different kind of tactics at coming at somebody than like, it could have been this thing. It's like, well, yeah, that's also how like drunk people at the bar convince you of really silly things, right? So,
Right. But Steve, listen, thanks for coming back and chatting with me. I mean, I appreciate hard questions. I think those are the types of questions that I get excited about, because then you get to actually dig into the text.
Well, yeah, it was interesting, and you gave me a lot to think about. So appreciate your guys' input. And
of course,
it's good work.
All right, call back soon.
All right.
Okay, Steve.